think in relationship to the work that I do and have done in queer theory, reproduction matters because it is one of the foundations of what we understand as heteronormativity. And heteronormativity works on an intuitive level to connect heterosexuality to life, and by implication to assign non-heterosexual sexualities to negative social values like sterility and death. And so there's been lots and lots of work in queer studies that both disputes that division, or in cases like, say, Lee Edelman's book, No Future, actually confirms that connection and builds a theory of queerness around what he calls the death drive. So reproduction also matters just in general in a feminist framework. It matters because femininity and femaleness has been defined in relationship to questions of reproductive potential. And reproduction is its possibility or its limitations are at the heart of all kinds of forms of social division, including class and race. So there's almost no part of social life that is not touched by the question of reproduction. Well, I like to think about myself as anti-disciplinary, if not undisciplined. So reproduction has been an interesting question for me in my work in relationship both to the way in which the body is defined, the way in which the gendered body is perceived, and what the perceived capacities of any given body are. So in a book about sort of popular applications of feminism that I wrote called Gaga Feminism, I talked about the fact that the spectacle of what was understood to be the world's first pregnant man, which was actually a transgender man who ceased taking testosterone in order to become pregnant with his partner since his partner was infertile, that the application of IVF and reproductive extension technologies to trans bodies is an unintended consequence of IVF research. And so IVF research, nobody would have said when they were developing IVF research, in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, we're hoping that this will eventually be used to make sure that trans people can have babies. That's not at all the way in which any kind of artificial reproductive capacity is used. Never has had the transgender body in mind. But the fact that we end up with the spectacle in whenever it was, 2008, 2009, of a pregnant man suggests that changes in reproductive habits in any part of the population have implications for everybody else. So, for example, a decline in reproduction for white women in France has implications for the ways in which immigrants are thought about in terms of potentially a higher birth rate among people of color in France. So as far as I'm concerned, in queer theory, in gender studies, in feminist theory, it is impossible not to think about reproduction. But the way to do it is to break out of a kind of individual model or a model within which people are choosing between different suites of possibilities, and always be thinking about these sort of reproductive systems within which every part of the society is changed by changes within one part of the system. Well, I mean, I think that an international conference on the global politics of reproduction would be important in any time, to be honest with you, again, because we've tended to measure reproductive health in such piecemeal ways, and we haven't thought about the fact that potentially reproductive health being enhanced in one part of the country may have consequences for women on the other side of the globe. But I would say that the obvious impetus has to do with the massive development of IVF technologies, the emergence of sperm banks, egg banks, all kinds of technical, medical, and other developments in relationship to reproductive opportunity, seems to me that requires some recalibration of the meaning of reproduction on a global scale. And obviously, reproduction has a massive impact on things like overcrowding. It can change the makeup of a population over the course of a few generations. It's interesting that our dystopian fantasies, like Children of Men, for example, focus upon the limited reproductive potential of many male bodies in an era of intense toxicity. And there are lots of species, I believe, of frogs and other amphibious creatures that have been negatively impacted by toxic environments and has produced sterility. So, the fact that we have now begun to think about dystopian futures in terms of future sterility suggests that we understand reproduction to be a site of crisis. The other sort of feminist reason to do a conference about reproduction in a global frame would be to start thinking about how the care of children, despite IVF, despite the all kinds of changes in the way in which we think about gender and gender roles, the bulk of the work of raising children has fallen to women alone. And I personally would love to know what's happening globally in relationship to shared childcare across male and female populations, and what the links are between poverty and women with children. So I think any kind of work that you do in the university, at some point you could probably tie what you do to a politics of reproduction in a global frame. That sounds pretty vital. I have personally, from my own research, have a lot of different questions, which is what about the study of reproduction, which would include whether ethically we would ever think that it was, ethically potentially wrong to increase these IVF technologies at a time of overcrowding, and given that these tend to be elite practices, harvesting eggs, surrogacy use, IVF practices, whether we're ethically obliged actually to think about the impact of these new technologies on what is already an intensification of the distinctions between rich and poor. What does it mean that wealthy people are paying for enhanced reproductive chances, while a new article recently in the New York Times showed that Black women experience infant mortality at a massively increased rate over white women? Where's all the research on Black infant mortality, for example? Does the money that is available for the research on IVF, could that money be better spent in any other part of a very broken health system? Are we so ahead of ourselves with these incredibly futuristic technologies that we've forgotten to look around and see that, particularly for precarious populations, we do almost nothing? So the financialization of a medical market, it seems to me, delivers much more than just healthcare to the wealthy. It offers them a very, very wide range of medical practices and medical solutions to things, while barely offering basic healthcare to poor people. We've had, in the last decade, we've had incredible epidemics like Ebola that have affected poor, often African countries in ways that are, both nightmarish and unimaginable in Euro-American context. And yet I feel that we don't make connections between some of the intensification of viral infections in some parts of the globe and the sterile environments that are created and protected in other parts. So I'm not, I don't study medicine. I'm not a sociologist of reproduction, but it seems to me that we're making massive financial investments in things that will deliver incredible results to a very small part of the population. And so my question would be, what about the whole project of offering opportunities for better health to people who don't have money or resources? How will those people be affected by the kind of work that you're doing in your projects and in your center? And is that even a reasonable question to ask? I'm not sure, but it's a question that's on my mind as I see more and more people spending more and more money to have the opportunity to either have a baby at a very advanced age, carry a baby in a system that has been rendered infertile in some way, pay for surrogacy. I mean, these all feel like really extreme things to be doing, again, against the backdrop of, let's say, a statistic around Black infant mortality. So how can we bring these are not two things, these are multiple things. How can these multiple questions about the best health for the greatest number of people be brought together, and how would you address that kind of ethical question in the project that you all are collectively engaged in?